So, I've been having some reconsiderations about my position on certain political stances. And this is triggered a lot by basically how Christianity has been reflected in government these days. And I realize a good majority of people who say they're Christian and are in seats of power kind of ignore basic tenets of Jesus's teaching. And a lot of people who might consider them Christian nationalists, or who might consider them kind of for Trump, I know from personal experience, there are some parts in their life where they believe that Jesus shouldn't be involved. I've had personal arguments. I've been thrown out of places because of that, when someone who I truly believed was for Jesus, even if they had political differences from me, I would call them out just for how they treated some people, and they got really upset, and they uttered the words like that this has nothing to do with Jesus, and that statement should never exist. And so while I look and try to evaluate at what part do, for example, Christian nationalists or Christian conservatives align with Jesus, and at what part are they going off the rails in some ways, and it's made me really consider Jesus and his teachings from a political standpoint. And I am, or at least have been, a moderate with conservative leanings, because I love Jesus, I love God, and their teachings are the highest. And so in political stances that would conflict with those teachings, obviously I would lean towards the ones that follow what Jesus says. And I think that's kind of where I'm getting at. That's where I feel like some of my political leanings are changing, because I'm being forced to look at what Jesus is teaching so that I know how to be the person God wants me to be, and so that I can identify how I should be acting. It's particularly in the context and the comparison of things like Christian nationalism. So conservatives, they tend to believe, from a political standpoint, that you should be working hard and earning your way. And I agreed with that. I to this day, I still agree with that, actually. You shouldn't just be sitting around and doing nothing. You should be working for the betterment of society, for the betterment of people. You should be working for God. And so that political standpoint tends to disincentivize things like handouts from the government, right? You're poor or you're homeless because you didn't get a job, or you're not doing the work you need, or we shouldn't have government handouts because government handouts disincentivize actually getting up and getting a job or going to work. But we need to consider, as Christians, how that thought process matches with the words of Jesus. So let's start with the greatest commandment, right? The greatest one is love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. But that's not the only core teaching of Jesus. There's other parts of that love that he calls out specifically and explicitly. We should be loving the poor. We should be taking care of the poor and the homeless and the downtrodden. This is a huge teaching. In fact, it's a major point of contention between Jesus and the religious leaders of his day. But Jesus also says you should love your enemy, right? So how does that translate to handouts? Well, Jesus calls us specifically to be generous and to give to the poor. right? To take care of those who mourn, who are widowed, who are homeless. He calls us to give that generosity to these people and take care of them regardless of why they're there, regardless of what circumstances put them in that position. So, should that translate to politics? Well, that's a big question, right? One of the arguments against it is that when Jesus calls us to give, we should be choosing to give, not forcing others to give. That's the big argument. And so if you make the government do it, taxes are effectively forcing people to give to these without an option. And I think that's where the real struggle is, But you've really got to think about, what would Jesus do? A term in the early 2000s that was thrown around like candy at a baseball field. I don't know, that's probably a bad analogy. But what would Jesus do? If Jesus were voting today for these initiatives, for food stamps, for maybe free housing for homeless, for maybe even some sort of basic income for people under the poverty line, like, what would Jesus do? Would you hear him say, no, I'm not going to vote for these because I don't want people taking advantage of it? Do you think that's something Jesus would say? Do you think that would be Jesus's argument? And if you know Jesus and love him, I think you already have your answer. No. That wouldn't be Jesus' answer. Would Jesus be involved in politics? That's another big question. Jesus was involved in politics when he was alive. Mostly it was about the Pharisees. And you might say the Pharisees is religion, it's not politics. But back in the day, the Pharisees controlled culture, right? They controlled, in a lot of ways, the way of life of the Israeli people. They were the administrating body of the Israeli people other than the Roman Empire. And Jesus directly confronted them and fought them and said, you should be taking care of people. And on the matter of taxes, enforcing people, like there was a temple tax, was there not? There was a tithe that you were forced to give. Maybe not by law, but by Jewish law. And that tithe was at least supposed to go to religious purposes. And Jesus was there. Jesus called out the Pharisees, saying, what are you doing? What are you doing for the poor? Maybe not those exact words. I don't want to get into, what's biblical exactly and what's not. But the heart of Jesus. And Jesus was calling out the Pharisees for being hypocrites, for not serving the people who needed them the most. He was involved in politics, and he even had opinions on taxing it itself. Give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God what is God's. He basically said in that moment, you should be paying your taxes, like it's righteous to. So yes, Jesus would be involved in politics, especially if we as a nation claim that we are under God. If we are going to be one nation under God, that blurs the line of having God involved in these actions. So I think the more I think about this and the more I consider, I can't help but think that Jesus's policies, Jesus's beliefs, Jesus's commandments to help the poor, to sell everything you have, either figuratively or literally, and give to the poor, would translate to what he wants us individuals to do when we vote. And it would be voting for these handouts. I truly think that Jesus, if he was here giving a sermon about how you should vote, because he wouldn't be like these other pastors. He would be giving sermons on how you should vote. He wouldn't avoid politics, because Jesus, that's who Jesus was. He didn't avoid the hard stuff. He didn't avoid the controversial things. So if he was giving a sermon on how you should vote, he would absolutely say, you should be voting to take care of the poor through food stamps, through handouts, through free housing, you know? And if your concern is, what about the people who would take advantage of it? And I go back to what I said about another key point of Jesus. He said, love your enemies, right? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. What would Jesus's opinion be on people taking advantage of handouts? Jesus said, if somebody sues you for your coat, and yes, I'm updating language here. If somebody sues you for your coat, give to him also your shirt. If someone forces you to walk 1 mile, walk with him too. So how would Jesus feel about people taking advantage of a handout system that you voted for? He would say, let them. Because to Jesus, it's about taking care of others and loving others. It's not about forcing others to work for the betterment of themselves. And that's also the same for God, right? Worry about nothing. Instead, pray about everything. God doesn't say, pull yourself up from your bootstraps. God says, come to me for everything you need. Pray to me for everything you need. That is what God's message is. That is what Jesus' message is. It's not about making these people work harder so that they can be above the poverty line. It's not about making the homeless work harder to get a job so that they can have a roof over their head and clothes on their back. And so I find that, at least in this instances, I think I'm politically shifting towards more liberal. And I mean, it's weird to say that, but I think Jesus, that's what Jesus would do. That is what Jesus would do. And yes, it's true. People on the liberal side tend to be more angry, more dismissive, more hateful towards people of the faith. But that shouldn't stop you from doing what Jesus has called you to do with your money or with your vote. You cannot say, this isn't about Jesus in any part of your life. Because every part of your life should be about Jesus. Thank you.